Let me tell you about the single most defining day of my entire life. It was the day the quiet, polite, people-pleasing mask I had worn for the better part of 5 years finally shattered, revealing a woman who would absolutely burn the world down for the creature she loved most. My name is Clara. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a botanical illustrator for a mid-sized publishing house, a job that requires endless patience, an eye for minuscule details, and long hours hunched over drafting tables. But my real job, my absolute passion and the very center of my universe, is being a mother to a scruffy, 35-pound, wire-haired terrier mix named Barnaby. I need you to understand just how important Barnaby is to me before I tell you what my mother-in-law tried to do to him. I adopted Barnaby 3 years ago. At the time, I was recovering from a devastating bout of depression following the sudden loss of my father. The world had felt like a suffocating, gray room with no doors and no windows. One rainy Tuesday, acting on an impulse I still can't quite explain, I drove to a dilapidated county animal rescue on the outskirts of the city. I walked past rows of barking, jumping, energetic dogs until I reached the very last kennel in the darkest corner of the concrete block. There, curled into a tight, trembling ball, was Barnaby. He had been found tied to a rusty guardrail on a highway overpass in the freezing rain, emaciated, terrified, and completely broken. He was missing patches of his wiry golden fur, and his dark brown eyes held a depth of sorrow that instantly mirrored my own. I sat on the damp concrete floor in front of his cage for 3 hours. I didn't speak. I just sat there. Finally, he uncurled, army-crawled to the chain-link fence, and pressed his wet, cold nose against my fingers. In that split second, a silent pact was made. We were going to save each other, and we did. Rehabilitating Barnaby took months of sleepless nights, thousands of dollars in veterinary bills, and a reservoir of patience I didn't know I possessed. We worked through his severe separation anxiety, his fear of sudden loud noises, and his absolute terror of men in hats. Slowly, the broken, shaking creature transformed into a goofy, bright-eyed, deeply loyal companion who shadowed my every move. He became my absolute shadow. When I painted, he slept with his chin resting squarely on my bare left foot. When I cried, he would forcefully wedge his warm little body against my chest and lick the salty tears off my cheeks until I couldn't help but laugh. Barnaby wasn't just a pet. He was the beating, furry heart living outside my chest. Then, there was my husband, David, a 30-year-old architect with a heart of gold, but a chronic, crippling inability to stand up to the antagonist of this story. His mother, Beatrice. Beatrice was a woman who seemingly drew her life force from the misery of others. She was a wealthy, retired real estate broker who lived in a pristine, soulless, sterile white mansion in a gated community 20 minutes from our modest, cozy suburban home. Beatrice was the kind of woman who considered an errant crumb on a countertop to be a moral failing. She wore stiff, tailored linen suits, suffocated herself in Chanel No. 5, and looked at the world through narrowed, hypercritical eyes. She hated me from the moment David brought me home to meet her. I was too quiet, my family wasn't wealthy enough, my degree in fine arts was frivolous, and my penchant for thrifted cardigans offended her upper-crust sensibilities. But her disdain for me was absolutely nothing compared to her visceral, burning hatred for Barnaby. To Beatrice, animals were nothing more than mobile vectors for disease, dirt, and chaos. She refused to even use his name, referring to him exclusively as that filthy mutt or the parasite. Whenever she visited our house, which was far too often, she would dramatically hold a perfumed handkerchief over her nose, loudly complaining about the non-existent stench. She would inspect my velvet sofa for dog hairs with the scrutiny of a crime scene investigator. If Barnaby, being the sweet soul he is, ever dared to trot over to sniff her expensive Italian leather shoes, she would shriek, kick out her foot, and demand I lock the beast in the basement. I refused, of course. I told her clearly and firmly that this was Barnaby's home, and she was merely a guest. David would always try to smooth things over, apologizing to both of us, caught between the wife he loved and the mother he was deeply conditioned to appease. The friction reached a boiling point about 6 months before the incident. We were planning a week-long anniversary trip to a remote cabin, and David, in a moment of misplaced familial trust, suggested we give his mother a spare key for emergencies. Just in case the pipes burst, Clara, he reasoned, looking at me with pleading eyes. It'll make her feel important, and maybe it will soften her up towards us. I fought him tooth and nail on this. I told him I didn't trust her in our home unsupervised. I told him I didn't want her snooping through my things. But David wore me down. He promised she would never use it unless there was a literal fire. Reluctantly, against every screaming instinct in my gut, I agreed. I handed over a shiny new brass key. What Beatrice didn't know, what she could never have possibly understood because she arrogantly viewed me as a naive, helpless bleeding heart, was that my protective instincts over Barnaby bordered on the extreme. I knew how cruel the world could be to animals. Because of his past trauma and his tendency to bolt if he ever got panicked, I had invested in the absolute best technology money could buy to keep him safe. Barnaby wore a thick, custom-made leather collar. Integrated directly into the heavy leather band was a state-of-the-art, military-grade GPS tracking unit. This wasn't some cheap, Bluetooth-reliant tag you buy at a big-box pet store. This was a professional-grade satellite and cellular tracking device used by search and rescue teams and hunting hounds. It had its own dedicated cell service plan. It monitored his exact location within 3 feet of accuracy, updated every 10 seconds, and had a battery life of 30 days. It even tracked his ambient temperature and heart rate. Furthermore, he was microchipped with an international registry, and his chip number was linked not only to my phone and email, but flagged with an explicit warning. Do not rehome, owner will prosecute. I was prepared for an open gate. I was prepared for a slipped leash. I was not prepared for pure, calculated malice. The day it happened was a beautifully crisp Tuesday in late October. The autumn leaves were blazing orange and red, and the air smelled of wood smoke. David was out of state on a 3-day architectural surveying trip in Colorado. I was scheduled to go into the publishing office for a crucial all-day strategy meeting regarding a massive botanical encyclopedia project. It was rare for me to be away from the house for a full 9 hours, but I had prepared perfectly. I took Barnaby for a long, exhausting 2-mile run at dawn. I fed him his favorite breakfast of kibble mixed with warm pumpkin puree and boiled chicken. I settled him onto his orthopedic memory foam bed in the sun-drenched living room, turned on classical piano music at a low volume to soothe him, and left him with a hollow rubber toy stuffed with frozen peanut butter. "I'll be back before dinner, my sweet boy," I whispered, kissing the top of his scruffy head. He wagged his tail, thumping it rhythmically against the floor, completely content. I locked the front door behind me, checked the handle twice as I always did, and drove to work. The first half of the day proceeded normally. I sat through endless PowerPoint presentations, taking notes and sketching quick floral concepts in the margins of my notebook. At exactly 1:45 p.m., my phone, which was sitting face up on the mahogany conference table, began to violently vibrate. I glanced down. The caller ID read, Beatrice. A cold, heavy stone of dread instantly dropped into the pit of my stomach. Beatrice never called me. We communicated exclusively through David or via terse, passive-aggressive holiday cards. For her to call me directly, while David was out of town, meant something was wrong. I excused myself from the meeting, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs, and stepped into a quiet, glass-walled hallway to answer. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Clara," Beatrice's voice came through the speaker. It was thick, trembling, and heavily laced with what sounded like breathless panic. But underneath the theatrical distress, my finely tuned ears picked up a faint, metallic undercurrent of forced emotion. "Clara, you need to come home immediately. Oh God, it's just awful." "Beatrice, what is it? Is the house okay?" "Is it Barnaby?" I demanded, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. "I am so sorry, Clara," she gasped, letting out a perfectly timed, dramatic sob. "I was just driving through your neighborhood. I had made a lovely organic chicken casserole for you and David, since I know he's away and you're so busy with your little drawings. I just wanted to drop it off and put it in the fridge. I used the emergency key." "You went into my house?" I interrupted, my blood pressure spiking. "I was just trying to do something nice," she wailed defensively. "But Clara," As soon as I opened the front door, that Barnaby. He just bolted. He completely lost his mind. He squeezed right past my legs before I could even drop the casserole dish. He ran straight down the driveway, took a sharp left, and darted right into the dense woods behind the subdivision. I tried to chase him. I really did. I ran in my heels until my ankles bled. But he's gone, Clara. He's completely gone. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The fluorescent lights of the office hallway buzzed loudly in my ears. For a fraction of a second, the sheer, paralyzing terror of losing my dog threatened to drown me. I pictured my sweet, timid Barnaby lost in the sprawling, hundreds of acres of dense pine forest behind our housing development. I pictured him cold, terrified, hiding under a log. But then, the panic abruptly hit a brick wall of pure, icy logic. Barnaby was terrified of the outdoors without a leash. He was agoraphobic. If a door was left open, his instinct wasn't to run out into the wild unknown. His instinct was to retreat under the dining room table. Furthermore, he hated Beatrice. If she came through the door, he wouldn't run past her. He would run away from her, deeper into the house, barking his head off. The story made absolutely no sense. "You're sure he ran into the woods?" I asked. My voice had completely lost its tremble. It was flat, cold, and dead. "Yes. I swear on my life," Beatrice cried, pouring on the faux anguish. "Oh, Clara, I know you loved that little creature. I feel just terrible. I've already called David. He's devastated, but he said he can't get a flight back until tomorrow. Don't worry, I'll stay here at the house. I'll make flyers, we'll look for him together." "Don't bother with the flyers, Beatrice," I said quietly. "I'll be right there." I hung up the phone. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I felt an absolute, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. It was the clarity of a predator locking onto its prey. I didn't run to my car. I calmly walked to the window overlooking the city street, pulled my phone up to my face, and opened the GPS tracking app. The screen glowed a brilliant, high-definition blue. It took 3 seconds for the satellite to ping the heavy leather collar. A red dot appeared on the map. I zoomed out again. And then, I zoomed out a third time. Barnaby was not in the woods behind our subdivision. Barnaby was exactly 52 miles away, traveling north on Interstate 95 at a speed of 68 miles per hour. I watched the little red dot glide smoothly along the digital highway. He wasn't running. He was in a moving vehicle. My eyes narrowed as I watched the dot approach an exit. I knew that exit. It was the off-ramp for Pine Ridge County, an impoverished, rural district notorious for having a massively underfunded, severely overcrowded animal control facility. It was a high-kill shelter. Because of their lack of resources, stray dogs brought there who were not immediately claimed were often euthanized within 72 hours to make room for the next influx. The absolute, unfathomable depravity of what my mother-in-law had done hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She hadn't just lost him. She had deliberately used her key, entered my sanctuary, somehow wrestled my terrified dog into her pristine Mercedes, and drove him over 50 miles away to a death camp for discarded animals, miles outside of our own county, so I would never think to look there. She intended for him to be killed. She wanted to erase him from our lives permanently, and she had meticulously planned the accident. I didn't bother going back to the conference room to get my purse. I just grabbed my car keys from my pocket, texted my boss a single sentence, "Family emergency, leaving now," and took the stairs down to the parking garage 2 at a time. I got into my Subaru, connected my phone to the dashboard display, and kept the GPS map open on the main screen. I merged onto the highway, my foot pressing the accelerator down until I was flying at 85 miles per hour. As I drove, my mind operated with the terrifying efficiency of a supercomputer processing a tactical strike. I watched the red dot turn off the highway. I watched it travel down a rural route. Finally, I watched it come to a complete stop at an address labeled Pine Ridge Animal Control and Shelter. It stayed there for 12 minutes. Then, the dot moved again, but this time, it left the shelter and began heading south, back toward the city. She had dropped him off. She was driving back to my house to play the grieving, supportive mother-in-law. I didn't turn around to intercept her. I kept my foot on the gas, racing north toward the shelter. The drive took me 45 minutes. When I finally pulled into the cracked, weed-infested asphalt parking lot of the Pine Ridge shelter, the grim reality of the place made my stomach churn. The building was made of cinder blocks, desperately in need of a fresh coat of paint. The deafening, tragic cacophony of 100 barking, stressed dogs echoed through the thin walls. I slammed my car door shut, marched up to the heavy metal front door, and yanked it open. The smell of bleach, wet fur, and fear was overwhelming. There was a single, exhausted-looking woman sitting behind a scratched plexiglass counter, sorting through a stack of manila folders. "Can I help you?" she asked, not looking up. "Yes," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the small, dingy lobby. "I am here to reclaim my dog. He was brought in approximately 30 minutes ago by a woman in her early 60s driving a silver Mercedes SUV. The woman looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Ma'am, we did just have a dog brought in about half an hour ago. But the woman who brought him in surrendered him as a stray. She said she found him running loose on the highway overpass just down the road. She said he was aggressive, and she didn't know who he belonged to." A surge of pure, white-hot rage flared behind my eyes, but I kept my composure absolute. "She lied," I stated clearly. "That woman is my mother-in-law. She stole my dog from the inside of my locked home in a neighboring county and drove him here to abandon him. His name is Barnaby. He is a wire-haired terrier mix. He is wearing a heavy brown leather collar with a GPS tracker embedded in the buckle, and he is microchipped. My name is Clara Miller, and my information will be the primary contact on that chip." The shelter worker stared at me, her mouth slightly open. She could clearly see the dangerous, unwavering intensity radiating from my posture. She didn't argue. She stood up, grabbed a microchip scanner from her desk, and said, "Wait here." She disappeared through a heavy metal door. I stood in the lobby, staring at the clock on the wall, listening to the agonizing sound of the barking dogs. Every second felt like an hour. 3 minutes later, the heavy door swung open. There, straining against a slip lead, his entire body shaking violently, was Barnaby. When he saw me, he didn't just run to me. He threw his entire 35-pound body at me. I dropped to my knees on the filthy linoleum floor and caught him. He buried his head into my neck, letting out a series of high-pitched, distressed whimpers that broke my heart into a million pieces. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his scruff, inhaling the scent of his fur. He was safe. He was warm. He was mine. I checked his collar immediately. The GPS unit was completely intact. Beatrice, in her arrogant ignorance of modern technology, probably just thought it was a heavy, ugly buckle and didn't bother removing it, likely terrified of touching him more than absolutely necessary. I stood up, holding Barnaby tightly against my chest. I looked at the shelter worker, whose eyes were now wide with shocked understanding. "Ma'am," the worker said quietly, "I scanned him. The chip is registered to you." It flashed a high-priority warning not to rehome. "I am so terribly sorry." She signed a stray surrender form. "That is technically falsifying government documents, as this is a county facility." "I know," I said, my voice dripping with ice. I reached into my purse and pulled out my driver's license, slapping it onto the counter. "Process the release paperwork immediately. And then, I need to speak to your facility manager or whoever is in charge of your security systems. Right now." 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a cramped, windowless back office with the shelter's director, a gruff, heavily bearded man named Tom. I quickly and clearly explained the situation. I didn't sound hysterical. I sounded like a prosecuting attorney laying out a timeline of events. "Look," Tom sighed, rubbing his forehead. "We have security cameras pointing at the parking lot and the front entrance. We upgraded them last year after a series of break-ins. They are 4K resolution. But I can't just hand over security footage to a civilian. You need a police warrant." "I understand that," I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. "I am leaving here and driving directly to the county police precinct to file felony animal cruelty, burglary, and trespassing charges against her. But before I leave, I need you to review the footage from exactly 2:15 p.m. today to verify what I am telling you. I need to know the evidence exists before I bring the police into this." Tom hesitated for a moment, looking at my stern face, then down at Barnaby, who was shivering under my chair. He sighed again, turned to his computer monitor and clicked open a program. He typed in the time code. On the screen, a high-definition, crystal-clear feed of the parking lot appeared. There it was. At exactly 2:14 p.m., Beatrice's pristine, silver Mercedes GLE pulled aggressively into a parking space, tires crunching over the gravel. The driver's side door opened. Out stepped my mother-in-law, wearing a navy blue designer pantsuit and her signature pearl necklace. She looked around nervously, her face twisted in a sneer of deep disgust. She walked around to the passenger side rear door and yanked it open. She reached in. For a moment, there was a struggle. Then, the 4K camera captured her violently dragging Barnaby out of the car by his leather collar. He was thrashing, his paws desperately scrabbling against the asphalt, fighting her with every ounce of strength he had. She yanked him forward, practically lifting his front legs off the ground, forcefully dragging him toward the shelter's front doors. She looked directly up at the camera for a split second, her face clearly illuminated in the bright afternoon sun, completely identifiable, before she shoved the doors open and disappeared inside. "Good God," Tom muttered under his breath, leaning back in his chair. She dragged him like a sack of garbage. "Save that file," I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Back it up to a flash drive. The police will be here with a warrant before the sun sets." I carried Barnaby out of that wretched building, placed him gently into the backseat of my Subaru, and buckled him into his safety harness. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my hands went numb. I let myself feel the blinding, destructive rage for exactly 60 seconds. Then, I boxed it up, locked it away, and started the engine. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to the Central Police Precinct of my own county. Walking into a police station to file charges against your own family member is a surreal experience, but I didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. I sat down with a detective, a seasoned, sharp-eyed woman named Detective Ramirez, and I laid everything out on her desk. I gave her the physical timeline. I showed her the GPS tracking data on my phone, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Barnaby had been inside my locked house, had been transported inside a vehicle, moving at highway speeds directly to the High-Kill shelter, and then left there. I provided the exact time codes for the 4K security footage sitting on the shelter manager's computer. I provided the false surrender forms she had signed at the county facility. When I explained that Beatrice had used an emergency key under the guise of dropping off a casserole to gain unauthorized entry to my home with the sole intent of stealing and abandoning my property. Legally, dogs are considered property, which made it a severe case of theft. The detective stopped taking notes and looked up at me. "Mrs. Miller," Detective Ramirez said slowly, "what you are describing, this isn't just a familial dispute. This is burglary in the second degree because she entered the dwelling with the intent to commit a crime. This is felony theft. This is aggravated animal cruelty because she dumped him at a high-kill facility knowing his life would be in immediate danger. She also falsified government documents at the shelter. If we pull that footage and it matches your GPS data, we are looking at multiple felony indictments. She will go to jail. Are you fully prepared to press these charges against your mother-in-law?" "Detective," I said, looking her dead in the eyes, my hand resting gently on Barnaby's head as he slept on the floor beside my chair. "I want her under the jail. Print the paperwork. I'll sign it in blood if I have to." The police moved incredibly fast. The GPS data, combined with the sheer audacity of the crime, was enough to secure an immediate warrant for the shelter's video footage. By Thursday afternoon, Detective Ramirez called me to confirm they had retrieved the 4K video. It was as damning as I had promised. The falsified surrender forms were confiscated as physical evidence. An arrest warrant for Beatrice was officially signed by a judge on Friday morning. But I didn't want them to just pick her up at her sterile mansion. I wanted a show. I wanted her to feel a fraction of the utter shock and devastation she had tried to inflict upon me. I spoke with Detective Ramirez, who, while maintaining her professional demeanor, seemed to harbor a distinct disdain for Beatrice's actions and agreed to coordinate the arrest with my schedule. Which brings us to the climax of this absolute nightmare: Sunday dinner. Every Sunday, without fail, David and I hosted Beatrice for an early evening dinner. It was a tradition David clung to, hoping to foster a relationship that simply didn't exist. David had flown back late Wednesday night in an absolute panic, having received frantic updates from his mother about the lost dog. I hadn't told David a single thing. When he rushed through the front door, dropping his bags and pulling me into a desperate hug, asking where the flyers were, asking where we needed to search, I simply whistled. Barnaby trotted out from the kitchen, wagging his tail happily. David froze. He came back. Mom said he ran into the woods. How did you find him? I sat my husband down at the kitchen table. For 2 uninterrupted hours, I laid out the truth. I showed him the GPS app. I showed him the timeline. I told him about the high kill shelter. I told him about the police report, the 4K video of his mother dragging my terrified dog across the asphalt, and the felony warrants currently sitting on a judge's desk. I watched the man I loved go through the 5 stages of grief in record time. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, a cold, hard acceptance. Beatrice had always been manipulative, she had always been cruel, but this crossed a threshold into pure, psychopathic territory. She had tried to kill a member of our family. David broke down and wept, burying his face in his hands, apologizing to me over and over again for forcing me to give her that key. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different. The lifelong spell his mother held over him was completely broken. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. "We host Sunday dinner," I replied. Sunday arrived. I spent the entire afternoon meticulously preparing a massive, fragrant pot, roast with rosemary roasted potatoes and glazed carrots. The house smelled incredibly warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the absolute warfare about to take place within its walls. Barnaby was safely tucked away in our master bedroom, deeply asleep on our bed with the door securely locked. At exactly 5 p.m., the doorbell rang. David stood up, his face pale but resolute, and opened the door. Beatrice glided in. She was wearing a somber, charcoal gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks, aggressively performing the role of a woman in mourning. She held a bouquet of white lilies, a funeral flower, in her perfectly manicured hands. "Oh, David, darling," she cooed, enveloping him in a dramatic hug. "Clara, my dear." She walked into the kitchen and set the lilies on the counter, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. "I am just so heartbroken. I haven't slept a wink since Tuesday. The guilt is just eating me alive. Have there been any signs of him? Any calls from the neighbors?" I stood by the stove, stirring the thick, dark gravy. I didn't look at her. "No, Beatrice," I said smoothly. "No neighbors have called." "It's just a tragedy," she continued, taking a seat at the head of the dining table as if she owned the house. "But, you know, these wild, untamed mutts. They have a mind of their own. Sometimes they just revert to their feral nature and run off to be in the wild. It's natural, really. Perhaps it's God's way of clearing space for you two to finally focus on having real children." David clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white, but he remained silent, honoring our plan. "Dinner is ready," I announced cheerfully, carrying the heavy roasting pan to the table and setting it down on a trivet. I began slicing the tender beef, placing generous portions onto expensive china plates. We sat down. The silence was thick, suffocating, and incredibly tense. Beatrice picked up her silver fork, completely oblivious to the radioactive energy radiating from her son and daughter-in-law. She took a delicate bite of a potato. "Well, Clara, I must say, despite the gloomy atmosphere, the potatoes are adequately seasoned." "Thank you, Beatrice," I said, taking a slow sip of my red wine. "I've found that proper preparation is key to a successful outcome. You can't just throw things together and hope for the best. You have to be meticulous, you have to plan ahead. Don't you agree?" Beatrice paused, her fork hovering in the air. She narrowed her eyes slightly, sensing a shift in my tone, but brushed it off. "Yes, well, organization is a virtue." "Speaking of organization," I continued, leaning forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, "I realized I never properly thanked you for bringing over that casserole on Tuesday." "Oh, think nothing of it, dear," she waved her hand dismissively. "Family takes care of family." "Did you notice Barnaby's new collar when you were over?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, losing all pretense of politeness. Beatrice stiffened. The air in the room suddenly turned freezing cold. I told you, Clara, the beast bolted past me. I barely saw him. That's a shame, I said softly, staring directly into her eyes. Because it's a very special collar, it's heavily fortified leather. But more importantly, it has a military-grade GPS tracker embedded inside the buckle. It tracks his location to within 3 feet, updates every 10 seconds, and maintains a 30-day log of his exact movements. I watched the color instantly drain from Beatrice's face. The expensive blush on her cheeks suddenly looked garish against her chalk-white skin. Her fork clattered loudly onto her china plate. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her eyes darting nervously to David, expecting him to intervene. But David just sat there, staring at her with an expression of absolute disgust. It's a fascinating piece of technology, Beatrice, I continued relentlessly, my voice rising in volume, echoing off the dining room walls. For example, on Tuesday at 2:14 p.m., the tracker indicated that Barnaby wasn't in the woods behind our house. It indicated that he was exactly 52 miles away, in the parking lot of the Pine Ridge County High-Kill Animal Shelter. It tracked him traveling at 68 miles per hour down Interstate 95. Unless my dog suddenly learned how to hotwire a car, I'm assuming he had a chauffeur. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. You're crazy, technology glitches, that machine is broken. Is the 4K security camera at the shelter broken too? I snapped, slamming my hand flat against the oak table, making the wine glasses violently tremble. Because the facility manager gave me the footage. It's incredibly high definition, Beatrice. I watched you drag my terrified, thrashing dog out of the back of your Mercedes by his neck. I watched you march into that lobby. I have the surrender forms you signed, falsifying your identity and claiming you found him as a stray. David, Beatrice shrieked, finally breaking her composure, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Are you going to let her speak to me this way? She is making up insane, slanderous lies. David looked at his mother, the woman who had controlled him, manipulated him, and belittled him his entire life. He looked at her not with anger, but with profound, devastating pity. Mom, David said, his voice cracking with emotion. I saw the video, I saw what you did. Beatrice froze. The realization that she was completely cornered, that her golden child had turned against her, hit her with the force of a freight train. Her arrogant facade crumbled, replaced instantly by vicious, cornered panic. Fine, she spat, her face contorting into a mask of pure ugliness. Yes, I took the filthy mutt, and I'd do it again. He is a disgusting parasite ruining your home. You should be thanking me. I was doing you a favor, ridding you of that pathetic shedding burden. You committed multiple felonies, I stated coldly, not moving an inch from my chair. You used a key you were trusted with to burglarize my home. You stole my property. You committed aggravated animal cruelty by dumping a microchipped domestic pet at a facility known for euthanizing animals due to overcrowding. You are a monster. Oh, please, she scoffed, crossing her arms defensively, desperately trying to regain her upper crust superiority. It's a dog, Clara, a street mutt. The police don't care about a lost dog. What are you going to do, sue me for the adoption fee? I'll write you a check right now for $50. She reached for her designer handbag, sitting on the empty chair next to her. As she touched the leather handle, the heavy silence of the dining room was abruptly shattered by a sound outside. It started low, then grew rapidly into a piercing, mechanical wail. The unmistakable, deafening sound of a police siren. Then, another joined it. Through the large bay windows of our dining room, the fading evening twilight was suddenly violently illuminated by flashing, strobe-like red and blue lights. The brilliant lights bounced off the walls, casting chaotic, dancing shadows across the dinner table. Beatrice stopped moving. She slowly turned her head to look out the window. 2 county police cruisers had just aggressively swerved into our driveway, blocking her silver Mercedes in completely. 4 officers were stepping out of the vehicles. She turned back to me, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful to witness. Clara, what did you do? I didn't sue you for the adoption fee, Beatrice, I whispered, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. I pressed charges. I told you, you have to be meticulous, you have to plan ahead. The heavy pounding on the front door echoed through the house like a thunderclap. Police, open the door. David didn't hesitate. He stood up, walked away from his mother without looking back, and opened the front door. Detective Ramirez stood on the porch, flanked by 3 uniformed officers. She stepped into the foyer, her hand resting casually on her utility belt. She looked past David, straight into the dining room, her eyes locking onto Beatrice, who was now trembling so violently she had to hold onto the edge of the dining table to keep from collapsing. "Beatrice Miller," Detective Ramirez called out, her voice projecting absolute authority. Beatrice couldn't speak. She just stared, her mouth agape, producing a faint, pathetic wheezing sound. The officers walked into the dining room. They didn't care about the expensive china or the ruined pot roast. They approached her with professional, unyielding efficiency. "Beatrice Miller, you are under arrest for burglary in the 2nd degree, felony theft, and aggravated animal cruelty," Detective Ramirez recited, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." "No, this is a mistake," Beatrice whimpered, shrinking back away from the officers. "I am a respectable citizen. I live in Oak Creek. You can't do this, David." "David, do something, tell them to stop." David stood in the doorway, his face an emotionless mask. "You have the right to remain silent, Mom. I highly suggest you use it." One of the officers stepped forward, firmly grabbed Beatrice's arm, spun her around, and forcefully clicked the cold steel cuffs around her wrists. The sharp, metallic click echoing in the quiet room was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire 28 years of existence. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer continued reciting her Miranda rights as they began marching her toward the front door. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they dragged her through the foyer, Beatrice completely lost her mind. The elegant, sophisticated society woman vanished, replaced by a screaming, thrashing, hysterical mess. She shrieked curses at me, she sobbed loudly, her expensive shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor. I walked out of the dining room and stood by the front door, watching them load her into the back of the police cruiser. She fought them the entire way, a pathetic display of shattered entitlement. I stood there, arms crossed, until the cruiser doors slammed shut, containing her hysteria. Detective Ramirez lingered for a moment on the porch. She looked at me, then looked down the hallway where Barnaby, having heard the commotion, had squeezed his head out of the slightly cracked bedroom door, whining softly. "Good dog," Detective Ramirez said quietly. She gave me a curt nod, turned around, and walked back to her vehicle. The cruisers backed out of the driveway, their red and blue lights slowly fading down the suburban street, leaving our home bathed once again in the quiet, peaceful darkness of a Sunday evening. David closed the front door, locked the deadbolt, and leaned his forehead against the solid wood, letting out a long, exhausted breath. I walked over to the bedroom, pushed the door open, and knelt down. Barnaby immediately trotted over, licking my face vigorously, completely unaware of the absolute justice that had just been served in his name. I buried my face in his fur, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart against my chest. In the aftermath, the legal battle was swift and brutal. Beatrice, terrified of actually spending time in a state penitentiary, hired an incredibly expensive defense attorney. But the evidence was absolutely insurmountable. The 4K video, the GPS data, the falsified documents. There was no defense. She ultimately took a plea deal to avoid prison time. She pleaded guilty to the felony theft and animal cruelty charges. She was sentenced to 5 years of heavily monitored probation, ordered to pay thousands of dollars in fines to the county animal shelter, and, in a stroke of poetic justice mandated by the judge, she was forced to complete 500 hours of community service, specifically cleaning kennels, at a municipal animal control facility. Furthermore, as a convicted felon, she lost her real estate license, and the scandal completely ostracized her from her snobby, elite social circles. She became a pariah. David and I changed the locks on our house the very next morning. We installed a comprehensive home security system, and we cut all contact with Beatrice permanently. We haven't spoken a single word to her in over a year and a half. Our house is quiet now. It is incredibly peaceful. The oppressive weight of her judgment and her cruelty has been completely lifted from our lives. David and I grew infinitely closer, forging a stronger, more honest marriage out of the ashes of that terrible weekend. And Barnaby? Barnaby is currently snoring loudly on the velvet couch, entirely safe, profoundly loved, and completely secure in his kingdom. He still wears his thick leather collar with the heavy, unyielding buckle. It's a reminder, not of the terror he faced, but of the absolute lengths I will go to protect him. Because some people think dogs are just property. They think they are disposable, but they don't understand that to us, they are our family. And you never, ever mess with my family.